Okay, are you ready? I think I'm ready. Probably about as ready as I'm going to get, so we should probably just go ahead and do this. What do you think? Let me welcome you to Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and I am coming to you this week from a hotel room in Tokyo, Japan. And it is the middle of the frickin' night right now. I don't know what happened. I have a routine that I usually use when I come to Japan. I stay up super late that first night and fight off the exhaustion and get like 6 or 7 hours sleep, and then I'm usually pretty synced up right away. Second day, I'm good to go. But this time, didn't happen. I'm like 3-4 days in, and I'm still passing out at 8 p.m. and waking up at 3 in the morning. So I'm up, I can't sleep. I figure I should use the time constructively and get this podcast to you. The good news is I'm in great spirits. Those of you who listened last week, you know I wasn't doing so great. Thanks to everybody who reached out with your support. But coming to Japan to teach is one of my great loves. I so appreciate the culture and the people that it produces. If you've been listening for long enough, I've recorded from Japan before and you've heard me talk about this. But there's just a sincerity and like a heartfelt inquiry. And they got like 1 or 2 more people to sign up. It's a small group. It's like 5 people, but they're so wonderful. Like we're already rolling, and it's passionate and it's real, and it's all the reasons that I'm a yoga teacher is what I get to do when I come to Japan. And it just makes everything better. So that's a good thing. But I have heard about some cracks in the civility in Japan, which is upsetting. In particular, what happened was the teachers who've done the training with me here, and I think we're up to like close to 200 teachers that have come through the training that I do when I'm here. They all formed like a community among them. They have Facebook groups, and there's sort of a support system where they've been working together and supporting each other in their work as teachers in a way that I don't see happening in other places. It just seemed very specific to Japan and the culture here. But I got a report that there's been like some Facebook trolling going on, where there's like 1 or 2 people going on to the Facebook group and like writing snarky, crappy, divisive shit and getting people all riled up and people piling on, and that same shit that happens in America on Facebook is starting to happen here in Japan. So shitty. I think Facebook's just infecting us all, man. And then something else that happened here, which was really disturbing, is how here in Japan, the way yoga has come about, it's a little bit behind the evolution that's happening in other places. And I've talked about this before. There's a theory about why that is. Back sometime, I don't know if it was the 70s or the 80s, there was like a cult here in Japan that released sarin gas in the subways. This terrible tragedy killed all these people. This cult was using free yoga classes to get people into the cult. So for a long time, there was like terrible taboo around yoga in Japan. And that changed over time, and now yoga is super popular in Japan, but it is predominantly hot yoga. Seems like some people here in Japan just adopted the model back home and created like, hot yoga franchises. So there's a lot of them, and hot yoga is very popular. I think it plays into certain aspects of the culture here too. But it's been here long enough that a few like prominent teachers ended up injured and then were public about that. So there's been this upswell of talk about injuries in yoga here in Japan. And so what happened was a bunch of people jumped to capitalize on that. And they've created courses where they can certify you as a safe yoga teacher, where they teach you what the biomechanics are, so the right angle of your femur bone to your hip to make it healthy. And then after you try to memorize all this information that's supposedly going to keep you safe in your yoga practice, they give you a certificate that says you're a safe yoga teacher, and part of the tuition cost, which is quite expensive apparently, is a liability insurance policy, which you then, of course, have to renew annually. So it's ugly. It's the same shit. The same shit. But fortunately, again, I still think there's certain cultural aspects here in Japan where I'm hoping it doesn't. I don't think it can. There's too much of a more collective vibe. Sometimes to a fault, I guess, but in any case, the experience I'm having teaching here is wonderful, as always, but I fear that it's only a matter of time before some of the pitfalls and not so great things that are happening back in America, it looks like they might happen here some too, or they already are. And speaking of crappy things happening online, I had somebody write like a total hit piece about me. I'm not going to tell you where it is because I don't actually want you to go read it, but someone with an anonymous profile who uses a pseudonym wrote a pretty scathing piece about this podcast. Most of it was the usual stuff. Jay's intros are long-winded, and he's forever interrupting his guests, which, again, yes, that sometimes happens with me. I think if you listen to the very first episodes and you listen to the more recent episodes, I think it's fair to say that I've improved in this regard, but I don't know about you. When I'm having a passionate conversation with someone, it doesn't usually happen that one person sits there totally quiet while the other person talks, and then when that person is totally done saying everything they want to say, then the other person talks, and it just cleanly goes from this voice to that voice to this voice. That's not usually how it happens. At least not with me, not when we're talking about something I'm passionate about. And I don't know, is that because of my white privilege? I wonder, does the same kind of thing happen in other communities, not white communities? Do people talk over each other when they're passionate in black communities and Hispanic communities and Asian communities? I would think probably, but I don't know. But the main thrust of the criticism was not that I'm a terrible interviewer, but that I don't have any guests of East Asian descent on the podcast. How can I have a podcast that's supposedly about yoga and I don't have anybody from India on it? And this is not the first time that people have said this about the podcast. And the last time people were saying this, it was people from India who were saying it to me, and I immediately reached out to all of them and said, "You're right. Please, will you come on the podcast and talk to me about why we don't hear Indian voices in the yoga world? Or if you don't want to come on the podcast, because some people are, quite frankly, too nervous. They don't want to come on the podcast." So I said, "Well, who do you recommend? Who do you think I should bring on?" And no guests came of it. Nobody took me up on it. So all I can do is ask and continue. I've got invitations out right now, people of Indian descent. Hopefully they'll book some time and I can talk to them. I would love that. But the fact that none of them have taken me up on it, or I haven't been able to get any guests on, does that really mean that I am silencing their voices? I'm very happy to lend this platform to anybody, really, who I think I could have an interesting conversation that others will appreciate and benefit from. So I'm saying this because I'm kind of betting that the people who wrote that stuff about me are listening right now. The irony is, you're probably listening right now. And if you are that anonymous person who wrote all that shit about me, hey, show your face. Come on the podcast. I will not even come at you in an aggressive way. I would like to connect you as a person and hear your legitimate criticisms if you have them. So, whoever you are, come on. This is about having a real dialogue, and I am really open to it. So, I invite it. I invite your criticisms if you have them. I am very happy to be transparent about the process of doing this podcast. Speaking of which, I think this intro is already getting kind of long-winded. We should probably get to today's episode with Gernot Huber. Gernot and I have a mutual friend and a guy named Zane Williams who I met at the Feathered Pipe Ranch last summer. Shout out to Zane and all my Feathered Pipe friends. Zane's been talking up Gernot to me for some weeks, saying that we had a lot in common and we should talk. And eventually I reached out and we found some time. Gernot sent me a very long email telling me about a lot of the stuff that he's teaching and his ideas, which I definitely agreed with almost all of it. But there was a few points where like my alarms went off and I was like, uh-oh. Gernot and me, we may have to have it out a little bit. But I had never met him before, so it wasn't like I wanted to just jump into that. So I do take a fair amount of time. Like the first half of this talk is just me getting to know him and kind of his background and stuff, like bio stuff. But starting halfway in, we do get to the yoga, and then we do actually get to the debate that I wanted to have. He was pushing back on my whole gentle is the new advanced thing. He thinks I've swung the pendulum too far back the other way. It ends up being a wonderful debate, very respectful, very friendly, and ultimately, I think, quite constructive. I'm excited for you to hear it today. Before we do, let me drop my stuff real quick. I'm going to be in East Hartford, Connecticut, April 8th. I'm going to be in Fishkill, New York, April 14th. I'm going to be in Falls Church, Virginia, April 27th through 29th. I'm going to be in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, May 5th and 6th. And I'm starting my teacher training in Easton, Pennsylvania, May 12th. You can find out about that stuff and more. You can listen to the archives of this podcast and read my blog and find my online yoga video stuff at jbrownyoga.com. If you're listening to the podcast and enjoying it, maybe you'd want to show us some support and go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation, or go to Apple Podcasts and iTunes and write a review and give us some stars. We really appreciate if you would do that. Okay, I'm going to touch base with you on the other side, tell you a little bit about next week's episode with Anna Forrest. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this talk that I had with Gernot Huber.
Hey, Jay.
Hello.
Let me plug in my headphones.
Sounds good.
I'm sitting on a yoga ball. Is that... No. Can you hear that?
No, I couldn't hear it.
Okay, good. Okay. I could always find a chair to sit on, but... because it's a little squeaky.
Okay. You have your headphones on now?
I do.
Yes, and we're coming from afar. You're in Thailand right now, is that right?
That's right. 12 time zones.
Wow. It's crazy how we can do that stuff.
Yeah.
The technology flowing.
Yes. Yeah. There are upsides to it.
Oh, yes, and many downsides as well.
And many downsides, yes.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm worried I'm going to mispronounce your name. Is it Gernot?
That is, that's great. But, there is actually a T that's non-silent, but then it ends up turning into Gernot. And I'd much rather have the sort of no T, long O pronunciation. Most people say it that way, Gernot.
Well, say it how it is meant to be said with the T pronunciation.
Gernot.
Gernot.
Yes.
Did I get it? Even close?
You got it.
Nice. Cool.
All right.
Well, it's fun to get a chance to talk to you. You know, our mutual friend Zane has been in my ear about you for a while.
Yes.
And then
and about you and mine.
I'm sure. He's just such a great guy, you know?
Yes.
And is he still in Thailand? Is he in Thailand with you? Did I get that right?
Yeah, he's here for another 10 days.
Oh, all right. And so that's how you happened into like one of my live stream classes, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, they invited me over.
Very cool. Well, I also really appreciated your email. It was really thorough, and I read through it all. And I got to say, I was very interested by some of the things that you wrote. And I feel like there might be a little bit of debate for us to have today, which will be fun.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, I kind of want to spend a little time getting to know you better before we get into any debate, so we can make sure it's all going to be on good, friendly terms. But really, I'm just curious because, you know, a lot of the people who've been on the podcast are from North America. And so to speak to somebody who comes from a very different cultures is something I've been wanting to try to do. And I was looking at your bio. It says born in South Africa and raised in Germany. And now you're in Thailand. So I'm sort of curious about you. So when did you were born in South Africa, but how old were you when you went to Germany?
2.5.
Oh, so really?
So, yeah, that really was more of an accident of geography. My parents are German, and were on an assignment in South Africa for 4 years. And so they didn't teach us any English. You know, they knew they were going back to Germany. And so I really kind of grew up as a, more or less regular German in Germany, although I just never really felt at home there, which is what prompted me to join an exchange program to the States when I was 16. And so I actually went to the States for a couple of years in high school. And then went back to Germany to finish high school, and then decided to go back to the States for college, and then ended up spending about 20 years in the States.
I see. Where were you when you were in high school? What part of the States were you?
1 year in Evansville, Indiana.
Okay. That's some America right there, huh?
That was quite a culture shock, yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And then 1 year in Santa Barbara.
Oh, okay.
California.
I grew up in Los Angeles, and my brother went to school in Santa Barbara, so I know Santa Barbara. So that's not quite the same as Indiana, I bet.
No. That was, much more my speed in a way. But, my mom actually was getting a master's at UCSB, and so I lived with her there for a year.
All right, so you decided after you finished school to come back to the States, and you did college there. And would you graduate? What was your degree in?
Modern thought and literature.
Modern thought and literature. Interesting.
Yeah, basically cultural studies. Philosophy, and then looking at cultural expression more for the political content than the aesthetic content.
Okay.
So a lot of Foucault and Derrida and
I see
all those
the big guns.
The big guns.
Gotcha. All right. So what did you do after school? Did you go into a certain field? But you went to don't you have a master's degree too? Did you do that right after? Or did you have life in between?
No, much later. I went to school in the Bay Area, and like many classmates of mine who didn't know what the heck they wanted to do, ended up working in Silicon Valley. So I ended up working for Adobe Systems for 5 years.
Okay.
As a tech writer and illustrator and editor. Then got recruited to another company in Silicon Valley, a little startup. And I knew that I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do, or there were sort of a whole bunch of options, and none of them seemed to really come to the fore. I've always been very interested in food, and so that was actually one possibility. So at the end of that, 7 years in Silicon Valley, I actually took a career counseling course because I knew I needed to find a new direction. And during that course, I had actually started yoga at that second company. Just a coworker of mine just asked me one day if I was interested in yoga, and I said, sure. He said, well, if you want me to teach you some, I practice in the spare room over lunch. So, if you want, just come and join me. And so I did. And he started teaching me Ashtanga, although he started actually mostly with pranayama. Mm-hmm. So it was actually a very, very gentle introduction.
And was this person a trained teacher, or was he just like showing you what he was learning?
Nope. No, he was a software engineer and just an interesting guy. And yeah, I'm pretty sure
he was just like, hey, do this. This is what I learned.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so for a while that was sort of, I was fairly casual about it. And took me, and I didn't go to any classes at that point. And then in this career counseling course, I had this moment where I was thinking, maybe I should be a yoga teacher. And I immediately dismissed it as a completely ridiculous idea.
Because it was back then kind of a ridiculous idea. You had a real job in Silicon Valley. Becoming a yoga teacher wasn't a great choice necessarily.
Well, but I knew that, I sort of knew I could do a real job. I could earn a good living. I could do the rat race, but I knew I didn't want to. I knew I wanted to get out. And it was hard to get out because in a lot of ways, it was very rewarding. You were sort of at the cutting edge of things, working with very intelligent people. Doing, creative stuff. There was definitely a rush to it.
Creating all the algorithms that are now controlling us now.
Yeah, exactly. It was a digital rights management company.
Yeah.
So we were sort of trying to figure out how to allow information to be shared online in such a way that the creators would still get paid. And the whole point was...
and you failed, basically.
And we failed.
You failed because content creators are not getting paid right now at all.
I know. And the idea was to create a system of micropayments so that you could, basically like read an article for 2 cents, or whatever.
But everything's free on the internet.
It completely failed, yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Anyway, so I knew.
That's a side tangent.
yeah,
but interesting, and also, I don't know. I could make sense. Like, what was it about those sessions at lunch that made you think, even though you disregarded it, why it could be a yoga teacher? What was it about your experience of practice that was making you feel like maybe that was the direction?
I feel like I got a sense for a different way of being, or now in retrospect, I could probably call it getting a glimpse of a truer part of myself, of my real self.
Mm. So that time represented, I'm trying to get, how does breathing and moving exercises get to that? Because I understand what you just said. I think a lot of people have that experience, but it's always interesting to me, like how if you have no frame of reference for yoga and you just start, like doing Ashtanga practice, which is particularly intense, and we can get to that later.
Yeah.
And still get to that, what you just said, that it wasn't about fitness. It was about like a part of yourself.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think he just didn't frame it that way at all. And as I said, since he started me with pranayama, I didn't even get, I didn't have that impression of yoga being about fitness. So I had a very unusual introduction to it, maybe. But it just made me feel different. I should backtrack a little bit. I ask myself to this day why I didn't get into yoga in college. Like, there must have been yoga there. And I was doing some modern dance in college, just dabbling, and some taekwondo, again, just dabbling. Like I was interested in movement. And if somebody had mentioned yoga to me, I'm sure I would have said, oh yeah, let me put that on my schedule for next semester. But I don't remember that being, it must have been there, but I just didn't know the right people maybe. And I had an interest very early in Eastern philosophy. And I remember reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was 15.
Yeah.
And, went completely over my head, of course. And
yeah, but still there was a glimmer, right? And Way of the Peaceful Warrior or whatever.
I tried reading the I Ching as well. Yeah. And then Carlos Castaneda, with sort of Native American mythology. And I also went to see the Dalai Lama in Santa Barbara in 1984 and was immediately struck by how different he was. It just before he even began to speak, just walking into the room, there was something dramatically different about him.
Like a frequency or something, right?
A serenity, a sincerity. Yeah, frequency is a good way to put it. And so I had these glimpses of, Eastern philosophy, and I knew I was attracted to that, but I didn't really consciously pursue it. And then yoga finally became sort of my entry point sort of for a more serious pursuit. But as I said, I had this glimpse during this career counseling course. And then I actually quit my job. And I had a couple of friends who invited me on a trip to Peru and Ecuador. And she was a school teacher and he was a software engineer he was good enough that he could take off time whenever he wanted to. Everybody wanted him anyway. So they were going for 3 months, and I had 3 weeks of vacation. And I said, oh, well, I'll be there for 3 weeks. And I told my new boss, who's one of the worst people I ever met in my life, which turned out to be one of the greatest blessings, because he said, you can't take your 3 weeks of vacation. And I had scheduled this vacation actually before he was even hired. And I said, well, I have 3 weeks. He says, you can't take them in one chunk. And I said, I planned this trip before you were even hired. He's like, I don't care. So I just said, well, okay, I quit.
There you go. It got decided for you.
Yeah, and without him, I wouldn't have had the courage to do that. If you'd said, okay, you can go, I would have been back after 3 weeks. So I called my friends and I said, look, okay, I just quit my job. Should I extend my 3 weeks to 4 weeks? And they're like, what are you talking about? 3 months?
Yes, you just quit your job. What else are you going to do?
So I did, right. So, I did. I changed the trip. I changed my flight and I did it for 3 months and loved it. Came back to San Francisco and immediately started planning my next trip, which was going to be Southeast Asia, Yunnan, and then Australia, and maybe the South Pacific. So I went off on a 7-month trip, came back, and then planned another.
And what are you doing during these trips? Like, what are you working? Are you like? What are you doing for money? Like, what are you doing for these 7 months in Peru?
3 months. So, yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm melding stories.
Yeah,
I know.
No. I actually managed to arrange a deal with my company, and they ended up paying me for I think another 6 months, maybe.
Oh.
And so that money allowed me to live on and travel on for a couple of years, really.
Uh-huh.
And
because in those countries you don't need a lot of money, like.
Yeah, and I was also really into photography. This was back in the days of film, still, and so that was actually one other pretty serious consideration, maybe becoming a photographer. And I spent a lot of time doing photography and just, walking around, and then spend a lot of time hiking and especially up in the mountains. And really kind of fell in love with wilderness and nature.
See, you went from digital to full analog.
Yeah, I did.
It's
and
beautiful.
then in Peru, I worked at a archaeological dig for a month. I had a friend in college who had studied archaeology, and so he had put me in contact with his professor who had an ongoing dig down there, and so I volunteered there for a month.
Did you find anything?
I got to excavate a human skeleton.
Whoa, that's
actually.
wild.
So it was, and draw drawings of the of how it was all arranged, and yeah, it was
okay.
It was really
so,
quite interesting.
So now I'm looking at like some bio points and some things are making sense. It says here that you taught wildlife monitoring to inner city youth. And then I also see here that you went back to school, right? And got a degree.
Right. So I think all this traveling, I was sort of thinking about, okay, how can I'd like to make a difference. I'd like to do something that I find really meaningful and really beneficial. And Silicon Valley was not it. And with all my traveling and wilderness traveling, I got really interested in nature and in conservation. And so that then became my new focus, and I decided I wanted to go into conservation biology. And so I got back to San Francisco, enrolled in City College, because I had taken no biology as an undergrad. I had one math class and one physics class, physics of music, no chemistry. And so I knew I needed to take those classes. So I enrolled in City College, tested my way into Chemistry 101. I had to actually pass a test, and Bio 101, and then an ecology class. And the ecology professor had this project where he was getting kids, his students, to do wildlife monitoring in various natural areas of San Francisco. So I signed up for that right away. And I had biology actually was one of my favorite subjects in middle school. And then I was become a bit of a birder as a younger teenager in Germany. It was sort of another. So I was out in nature a lot.
Wait, what's a birder means? You watch birds?
Yep.
I'm sorry, I just never heard that expression before. A birder is somebody who watches birds. You're like a bird watcher.
Exactly. Non-birders call them bird watchers, but birders call them birders.
Well, see, now we know. Basically. Now we're in the know. They're called birders.
Yep. Yes, you're right. Basically a bird watcher. Spend a lot of time outdoors. So I thought, okay, well, I already know birds fairly well. I may as well stick with that. And so I became part of this monitoring project in Golden Gate, not Golden Gate Park, but the Presidio, actually. Okay. And then through that involvement, was offered a job which was a National Audubon, which is a sort of bird conservation society. Yeah. They had written this grant and received it to train inner city youth to do wildlife monitoring. And so I was one of the people hired to do that. And then I, looked for the next job, and I managed to snag a field biologist position with Point Reyes Bird Observatory, another sort of well-known conservation organization. And ended up working at Mono Lake in the Eastern Sierra, doing bird censuses and mist netting, which is you're catching birds in a very sort of prescribed protocol, and that gives you an idea of trends in bird populations over time, because you're doing that every year, and so you can see, this year we've only caught half as many red-winged blackbirds or whatever. So it was probably a population decline. Loved it, and I was working at a restaurant at the same time. One of those, local ingredients, seasonally changing menu, and was still thinking about that too.
Okay, so you had both. Pots. I had 2 pots. I had a music and a yoga pot for a long time before I let go of one.
So I had the food pot, the biology pot, and a little bit of the photography thing, because I was taking photography classes at City College too.
Okay.
And learning how to print from slides and things like that back in the good old days.
Yeah, none of that nowadays, right? See, Adobe took over.
Yeah. And so then I met my professor, the person who ended up being my professor, had done his PhD work at Mono Lake and was still running projects there. So I met him there, and I guess he was intrigued by me, and I ended up applying to a bunch of grad schools. But I was sort of an odd character. I was close to 40 at that point. Hadn't done any biology as an undergrad. But had tested well on the graduate application,
and
tests
you had lots
for biology.
Of real world experience,
and
that's
exactly.
worth a lot.
Yeah. So I actually got accepted to Cornell and moved to, left San Francisco, moved to upstate New York to do my PhD in biology. And at sort of the last year or so in San Francisco, I actually finally started taking some yoga classes. My girlfriend at the time actually sort of took me along to this Iyengar teacher called Carl Erb was his name, who was ironically another software engineer who had kind of started teaching yoga on the side and then eventually quit his day job and became quite a well-known Iyengar teacher in San Francisco, and then died very early of cancer. But so I took, and he was a very interesting, he was not a typical Iyengar teacher either, very gentle and slow and with a really dry sense of humor that I related to.
Mm-hmm.
So, he had my idea of yoga was very, I hadn't really experienced mainstream yoga yet.
You didn't go to like a gym first or like a hot class first or something like that?
Nope. Never been to a gym yoga class or a hot yoga class. At the very end in San Francisco, I remember taking a couple classes at Yoga Tree on Valencia, which was sort of becoming the premier studio in San Francisco. So
I lived in San Francisco for about 6 months in 1994. I lived in Bernal Heights, and I worked at Leather Tongue Video on 18th and Valencia.
The restaurant I worked at was in Bernal Heights.
Yeah, okay.
The Liberty Cafe.
I have memories of it. My experience was I was in a very bad place and I had to run away from New York, and some friends of mine had this room in this house for $200 a month. And I went and crashed there until I got enough money to come back. And I remember it being pretty easy space. In fact, I was doing dancing at that time as well. And we put on a show while I was there at a place called 848 Divisadero, which was like this kind of alt practice show space that these guys had.
Cool.
So I have some memories of that time, I think, when you were kind of around. Interesting.
San Francisco, I moved from the peninsula to San Francisco in 97, moved to the Mission, which was still, you could still hear gunshots on a regular basis. And
but then you came to New York to do this grad degree. Now, I was looking, and I got to say, I'm looking at what you defended your thesis on, the correlation between wing shape and migration distance. So how did you end up, you told us you were into birds, you're doing all this work, you met this guy, and so how do you get to wing shape and migration distance?
Well, I'd always been fascinated with migration and movement, maybe in part because I had done a fair amount of moving around. so that was what I was already thinking about in terms of studying. And I think that was also part of the reason why my professor was interested in me, because he had some projects that along those lines that he wanted to. At that point, they were just starting. They had GPS trackers for bigger birds, so you can actually figure out where an individual bird was going. But they were too big for the small birds he was working with, and so they're working on creating smaller tracking devices that you would have to recover from the birds. So that makes it much harder, and that would record very. Really only sort of daylight, sunset and sunrise information from which you could then calculate the latitude that the bird was at. So anyway, he was sort of thinking about this. He had some people working on that, and he thought I would be a good person to maybe use these and help sort of further the development. And I think maybe my computer background may have sort of given him the idea that I would.
I see. The birds, the computers, the tracking devices, it all comes together in the migration patterns. And so why does it, so the idea is depending on the shape of the wings is how far they migrate?
Yeah. So my professor was studying swallows, and so I came into his lab, and I was... just come from San Francisco, I was pretty sure I was going to hate Ithaca, at least the winters, if nothing else. And so I heard of an interesting swallow population in Argentina that nobody had really studied, but that was a curious phenomenon. And so I sort of quickly realized that if I made that my project, I would have to be in the field from November through February.
You're just trying to find a reason to be in Argentina.
In the summer, right? And it so happened that they were breeding just near the coast. So I was actually going to be basically living on the beach in Argentina. So I made that my project. I mean, it was also actually very interesting from a migration perspective. And I don't know how much detail you want me to go into. No, but
you said there was like some kind of something going on there that was interesting migration-wise.
Basically, there were birds that traditionally were breeding in the northern hemisphere and were wintering in the southern hemisphere, long-distance migrants that had started breeding in the southern hemisphere. And there are only 4 documented cases of that happening in recorded history. And nobody had actually studied this population. So, and one of the interesting questions was, how would that affect their migration behavior? Anyway, so that was
Did you figure out why that those birds did that?
No, that would have been the PhD. What I ended up doing is I ended up leaving, switching over to a master's because grad school was so incredibly stressful. For me, Silicon Valley was nothing in comparison.
I see.
And so what ended up being my master's thesis would have been the first chapter of my PhD thesis.
I see.
Right? And that was just sort of an overview of, how migration and wing shape, because wing shape was one of the ways in which I was measuring what was going on there.
Well, and I'm going to interject for just a second, because I've actually been thinking about birds recently, because Thea Wildcroft was on the podcast, and she was talking about murmuration, which I thought was pretty awesome, that kind of concept, the way the birds keep this vicinity to one another and create those incredible patterns in the sky.
Yes.
Pretty wild. So I guess I think you could probably learn a lot from birds.
Yes. They are fascinating creatures, and they actually have a couple of... a couple of insights that have come from this. But so with the migration, there's a pretty strong pattern in birds that migrate longer distances have longer, more narrow wings. They're aerodynamically more efficient, and so better suited for long-distance migration. They are, however, not as good at escape flight. So if they're on the ground and getting chased by a cat, they are less likely to get away. So there is a trade-off. And the interesting was in swallows, in all the studies that have been done over the centuries, actually, there's always been a correlation between longer distance migrants, pointier, longer wings. In swallows, the correlation was actually reversed. The long distance migrants had shorter, more rounded wings. And so I set about trying to explain why that might be, and came up with a couple of, I think, pretty good hypotheses that are difficult to test, though. Anyway,
but it seems like, and I know this to be true because now you're in Thailand teaching yoga, you didn't end up being an evolutionary biologist.
No. So as I am moving to New York, also meant breaking up with my girlfriend because she didn't want to leave San Francisco. And so it was a rough time, and I started at that point really sort of going to yoga class with some regularity. And then once I arrived in Ithaca, found a good yoga teacher there who was a Kripalu teacher, but again, a very sort of just amazingly gentle soul. He was actually, I think, a black belt Taekwondo as well, but he was at that point probably in his early 60s, and another one of those people who sort of have a different vibration, and you notice it right away, just calm and centered.
They have that quality, and you're like, I'd like some of whatever that guy's eating for breakfast.
Exactly. And so I was going to his classes very regularly, and one day I sort of realized that the best part of my life was my yoga. It was the one thing that was keeping me sane. I like to say that I realized that yoga was no longer optional in my life. And so I met a woman from New York City, and so we'd started dating and doing this long distance thing, which neither of us really wanted to do, but we were into each other enough that we said, well, okay, fine. And she was doing yoga too in New York City, and we ended up, she's Thai American, and the first year I took her to California on vacation. We sort of, we went around California, I showed her all my favorite spots, and then the next year she said, well, why don't we go to Thailand? Because she actually had a couple of friends from New York who had moved to Chiang Mai for a couple of years. He had gotten a temporary gig at the university, and so they were there. And so we went to Chiang Mai to visit them and to sort of check it out, and fell in love with the place, and had a conversation pretty soon afterwards. She asked me, would I move to Thailand with her? And, I was still in the middle of my PhD.
But stressed out, because you said it was pretty stressful.
Totally stressed out. And in part, I think because I was sort of the odd one out. Like, I had a perspective on biology that was a little bit more old school in the way of sort of natural history rather than quantitative computational biology, which is where everything was and probably still is going. And my different perspective was not appreciated. It was kind of thought of as the outmoded way of doing things, the less rigorously scientific way of doing things. And so
you were like too woo-woo in that community?
Exactly. I was too woo-woo in that context. That's
actually, some listener told me I'm not supposed to say woo-woo, that there's like some kind of not PC part about that. I apologize if I'm offending anybody, but I just meant that you were the one who was a little too touchy-feely. Let's say that. How about that?
Yes. That's right.
Okay. That makes sense. And then you went in that direction. You went in a more touchy-feely direction, and you went with your yoga.
I did. Well, so it wasn't clear yet. Basically, we ended up, she said, why don't I go first and see if I can find a job? And if I can't, I'll come back. I could give myself 3 months. I said, sounds good. So she flew off to Chiang Mai, found a job. And so then I said, okay, well, I'm going to go to Thailand. So I called my committee together and I said, I'm moving to Thailand. I'm going to finish my PhD from there. And they're like, no, you're not.
It's just like before. This is a pattern that's happened for you before. The last time you went to take your 3-week vacation and they said, no, you're not.
Yeah. So they said, actually what they said was, well, you can do your PhD if you stay here. If you're going to Thailand, you can switch to a master's. And I said, okay, I'll switch to a master's. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And ironically, originally I had actually planned just to do a master's, but then a couple of friends of mine had talked me into doing the PhD, and which was, I think, the right move if I really wanted to be in the field, because at that point, everyone who just had a master's wasn't able to get funds anymore, and all my friends in biology who had
the
masters,
academia gig is not much easier than the yoga gig.
No. They all started PhD programs soon after me because they had to in order to be able to write grants.
All right, so now you're in Thailand.
So now I'm in Thailand. I've got to finish. I got to write my thesis. I got all my data, but I got to write this damn thing.
Yeah.
And I got to figure out what to do next. I remember I brought a book with me to Thailand it's this like photography resource book, like with all the galleries and like all the competitions, all the places where you might be able to submit work to, make some money. So I know for sure that I was still thinking about photography at the time.
You're still keeping that possibility alive.
The yoga hadn't completely become the clear option. I'm not sure. But then my wife and I then started going to classes in Chiang Mai and a couple Anusara teachers here, which was kind of her. She was doing Anusara in New York before then.
I see. So was she a teacher as well?
No. So she's a public health researcher, and she was just doing yoga, for how it made her feel.
Yeah.
As a student,
like a lot of people.
Yep.
Yeah.
And but in that year, I started taking more and more yoga, and then one of the women who was teaching at the local studio was assisting a teacher training that was going to happen in Chiang Mai later that year, and I really liked her, and I didn't know the teachers who were teaching the training, but I thought I trust her judgment, and it's right here, and so I signed up for that teacher training.
And who was 2009. Who were the teachers?
Sarah Yvonne Stover and Kimberly Johnston.
No, I don't know. I'm not sure who they are.
Yeah, so Sarah has kind of left the yoga world. Mostly she does sort of women's empowerment stuff around, sort of embracing menstruation. She has this whole thing about the red tent.
Okay.
And I'm still on her mail list, which is funny because she sort of assumes that she only has female students. So it's always like, dear lovely
That's
ladies.
Good. You get to get a glimpse in. Glimpse in. It's good for us to understand the point of view, especially these days.
Yeah. Kimberly was the co-teacher. She was doing all the asana and alignment stuff, and she had studied with. I don't know if she'd studied with Iyengar, but she had a strong Iyengar background and also a strong Ashtanga background. And she was, in fact, the substitute for Richard Freeman at his Boulder studio for a while.
Okay.
A rather thankless job.
Well, no, still, even just to know you did it, there's a certain...
Yes.
I covered for Richard Freeman is not nothing.
No, but having to teach a class of people who wanted to be taught by Richard Freeman.
Oh, yeah, that's
right.
Hard.
And she had this very interesting story about that. Anyway, what she would do is she would come into the class and say, "I know you were all expecting Richard today, and I'm not him. And so if you really wanted to, take a class with Richard, and this is just not going to do it, then I'm going to close my eyes for the next 3 minutes, and you can just get up and get your refund.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to close my eyes so you can leave if you want and not feel like you're offending me.
Yeah, I thought it was great. So that has really stuck with me. So she was really quite wonderful.
Yeah.
And then they had put together a good team. The philosophy teacher was Carlos Pomeda, who you probably have heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of a body worker from LA, Helen, blanking on her name now.
What was it, like a month-long thing or something?
Yes, yeah, it was like a 5-week residential thing, and I loved it.
Yeah.
I had a fantastic time. I actually ended up defending my thesis, flew back to Ithaca in April 2009, did the teacher training in June 2009, got married in July 2009, and then started teaching yoga full-time in August 2009.
2009 was your year, man.
Was the year, it was.
And you're in your 40s at this time.
At that point, I'm 42.
See, isn't that interesting? Like, usually that stuff happens when you're 27.
I guess so.
Maybe not, but...
So it was my, third career path. And I thought that there were more yoga teachers.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.